Hi everyone and welcome to the internet. What we're going to be doing in today's biology lesson is having a look at the process of natural selection. So hopefully by the end of this lesson you're going to be able to explain what natural selection is and how it leads to evolution. Starts off though, we've got 3 questions on the screen, so have a go at answering these in your book for me. Let's go through and mark our answers then. So the scientists that made the discoveries. The genetic material being acidic was Misha. The double helix structure of DNA was Watson and Crick. And the characteristics being passed from one generation to another was Gregor Mendel. So give yourself a mark for each of those you got right. Question 2. The purpose of the Human Genome Project was to sequence all genes in the human body. And for number 3, a mutation is a change in the DNA base sequence. So give yourself a total out of 5. So first thing I'd like you to do then is write me down a definition for what you think evolution actually is. Hopefully what we've got written down is that evolution is the gradual change in a species over time. So if you don't have that definition, then write that down for me. Now the key thing here is it is a gradual change. It's not something that happens immediately, it's something that takes quite a long time. So gradual change in a species over time, that is our definition for evolution. Now, what we actually find is that for organisms to actually evolve, then they go through a process that we now know as natural selection. So what I'd like you to do is write down that first sentence, and then what we're going to do is watch a little video about natural selection. So what you're going to do is watch the video and then make some notes about how this actually takes place. So I'll give you about a minute to write down that first sentence, then we'll watch the video for you to make notes on how natural selection takes place.
Charles Darwin was a famous scientist in the 1800s. He was famous because he came up with an idea that changed the way we think about life on Earth forever: the theory of evolution. Darwin loved animals and studied them all of his life. In 1831, he went on an exciting voyage aboard the ship HMS Beagle. The Beagle visited the coast and islands of South America and Australia, where Darwin observed and collected a wide range of weird and wonderful plants and animals. When he got back to England, he analysed his collection closely. That was when his ideas about evolution started to form. Darwin had found around 15 different species of finch when he was on the Galapagos Islands. He noticed that the birds were similar to other finches in lots of ways, but their beaks were all different shapes. Darwin looked into it further. He realised that the different beaks matched the type of food available on each island. The finches who ate insects had skinny, pointed beaks, so they could pick them up better, and those that ate hard fruits had beaks that were sharp, so they could get through the skin. Darwin decided that there was only one way that this could have happened. The birds must have adapted to their environment over time. This led into another idea, which he called the survival of the fittest. In any environment, plants and animals from the same species show natural variation in their physical characteristics, such as neck length in giraffes. Darwin suggested that those plants and animals best suited to their environment are more likely to survive and pass on their characteristics to their offspring. Over a long period of time, the characteristics of the surviving members of the species will come to predominate. Confused? Take the peppered moth. In London in the early 1800s, 98% of peppered moths had light-coloured bodies, only 2% were dark. The light moths were very happy because they were the same colour as the trees, which meant that they could easily hide from hungry birds. The dark peppered moths were easy to see and, well, eat. Then came the factories and the smoke of the Industrial Revolution. Many trees turned black with soot, and suddenly it was the dark moths who were able to survive better in their environment. By 1895, the dark-peppered moths made up 95% of the population. That's quite a turnaround. The process of natural selection usually takes much longer, but this is a good example of how it works. What about us humans? Good question. Darwin went on to suggest that humans share a common ancestor with modern apes. This was controversial because it went against the religious beliefs of many people. Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection had a great impact on the world. Today, it is widely accepted as our best scientific explanation of how life on Earth works.
What we're going to do then is go through the individual steps. So what we'll do is take it one step at a time, because this is again one of these common 6-mark questions, because there's plenty we can write about. If it's not a 6-marker, then it can also come up as a 4-mark question. So this is one of those topics that I suggest you really prioritise learning well at an early stage. So our first step is variation. And what do we mean by that? What we actually mean is that within any given species, then the organisms within that species show variation. So they show differences to one another. And what we find is that as mutations occur, so changes in the DNA, then we get an increase in variation. So our first step is organisms within a species show variation, and those variations are caused by mutations. So jot down those couple of points for me. I'll leave it up for another couple of minutes for you. Step 2 is known as survival of the fittest. So what we mean by this is that in any given environment, then if we've got variation within our species, some are going to be better adapted to survive than others. And those organisms that are best adapted to their environment will survive longer. Those who aren't well adapted, well, it's going to be death for them, sadly. So what we see with survival of the fittest, the best adapted organisms survive, the not well adapted will die. Again, a couple of minutes to write those points down. Step 3 is reproduction. As we just said, those that are best adapted to their environment are going to survive longer. And if they survive longer, then they're more likely to survive to an age where they're able to reproduce. So this is our third step. The best adapted are more likely to survive to reproduce. So 1 minute to write that one down. Stage 4 is passing on the advantage. And by that we mean that in the process of reproduction, then the genes from the parents are being passed to their offspring. So that means that those offspring are likely to have the same advantageous characteristics as their parents. Because remember, it was those that were best adapted that survived. They survived long enough to reproduce, and when they reproduce, they pass on their DNA, which means they're likely to have those same advantageous characteristics. Our fifth and final step is the repeat. So this is going to happen, those steps 1 to 4, over and over and over again. And this is going to take quite a long time. And over a long period of time, we can eventually get to a new species being developed. So if you get one of these 4 or 6 mark questions on how natural selection takes place, you've got those 5 steps you need to include. So literally 5 sentences will get you your top marks. You can obviously add in a bit more detail if you want, but you've got those 5 steps, you've got the process. So what we actually see is that over long periods of time, then these different species will actually evolve. They'll become better adapted to their environment through the process of natural selection. Because those ones that weren't well adapted, well, they've died off. So their features aren't being passed on, and your species is becoming more finely tuned to its environment. What we're going to do is have a look at two examples of where we've seen this happen. The first one is in the peppered moths, which we saw in our video. So what we saw is before the 19th century, then the majority of peppered moths were light in colour. And because the trees were light in colour too, they camouflaged really well and you couldn't see them. And if you look at the top picture on the left of your screen, there are actually two peppered moths there. You've got the dark one, which pretty clear, and then the light coloured one you might just about be able to make it out towards the right hand side of the picture, and then it's going kind of vertically. Then what we saw was the Industrial Revolution took place and the trees became covered in soot. So at that point we've got a situation like the bottom picture where the dark moth on the left hand side is really well camouflaged and the light moths stood out like a sore thumb. So that meant the birds then changed from eating the dark moths, which were easy to see, to the light moths, which were at that point easier to see. And we see that change. So in the urban areas, the dark moths became more common. So make sure you've got a summary of those points written down in your books. The second example we're going to look at is antibiotic resistance in bacteria. And we're going to have a little look at why this is a problem in more detail when we get on to B6. Now, when we think about bacteria, this is a rather simplistic organism and they're able to reproduce in a short space of time. So they can reproduce every 20 minutes, for example. Now, what we find is that within the bacterial genome, then they have these mutations that make them resistant to the antibiotics we take to cure ourselves of various bacterial illnesses. Now, because the bacteria replicate through mitosis, where they're producing genetically identical offspring, then if the parent cell is resistant to the antibiotic, then all of the offspring will be too. So that means we end up with a whole species of bacteria potentially becoming resistant to our antibiotics. And that's a big problem for us because if they're resistant to our antibiotics, they don't work. So you get ill with a bacterial infection with one of these resistant bacteria, we may not have drugs to treat you. And that's why it's so important that if you have a course of antibiotics from the doctor for something, you take them all as prescribed, not stopping when you feel better. Because as soon as you start doing things like that, we increase the risk of antibiotic resistance. Last thing for today is our plenary. So those of you with target grades up to grade 5, it's the column on the left. Target grades over a grade 5, it's the column on the right. And something I'd suggest you all have a go at doing is your little task at the bottom to create a cartoon strip. So I'll leave these up for about 3 minutes today, but as always, if you need longer, by all means hit pause, take as long as you need.